Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, workflow. That word is like a verbal hand grenade. Pick it up, pull out the pin, throw that word into a room full of geoscientists, and boom! Typically, chaos results. Why is that? Well, it's very controversial. No one can agree on what a workflow is, or how you approach it, or even what it's for. So you'll have ensuing arguments that go on for weeks, if not years, about why you're doing it in the first place, and where you should start your approach from. Do you go from the bottom up, with the things that people are actually doing? Do you go from the top down, and try to map it out all around the decisions that are being made? Do you try to follow what happens in the applications, or do you try to follow the data flow instead? These debates can go on and on and on. So, my name is Richard Grant, and I'm going to address that issue of the workflow today and propose a flexible, component-based approach that might help us on this task. First of all, if you're in the role of IT support or data management, why do you actually even care about the workflow? Surely it's not your problem. It's for the business to tell you what the workflow is so that you can support it. But is that really the case? Surely it's a joint responsibility. In order to provide the best possible support for the business, we need to work on that jointly and have some means of communicating that with each other. So let's look at the possible situation that we're in right now. What's your reality right now? Many of you, well I'm sure, over the last months and years, will have at some stage experienced company growth, or mergers, or acquisitions, or the opening up of overseas offices. And the result of that is more and more applications, more and more data data types. And all of that leads to higher and higher costs and bigger support headaches. Many of you perhaps recognize an applications portfolio that comprises dozens, if not more, applications, hundreds of modules, a plethora of different data types and databases, all of which are harder and harder to support effectively. Some of you may have even been in the unenviable position of having to referee or arbitrate between different groups of users that are proposing a new application, perhaps two completely different applications for exactly the same purpose. And without some sort of framework or context to look at that decision and to understand it, it's very hard to push back against their interests. Consequently, it's most likely both will win, and you'll end up with even more and more applications, more and more different proprietary data types that you have to try to support. So how do we dig ourselves out of this hole? Well, why don't we just try to imagine the idealized situation, try to imagine the ideal applications portfolio. Probably looks something like this. As few applications as is reasonable, underlined with as common a data standard as possible, all put in place to support a well understood and well communicated workflow. And oh, that's where we hit the wall. What is a workflow? The answer to that depends. If you ask a geoscientist what is the workflow, the answer will always be the same. It depends. It depends on the data that's available. It depends on the geology and the area that you're looking at. It depends on the time and money available. And usually, it just depends on who it is that you actually ask in the first place. So the answer has to be, the only conclusion is, there is no such thing as the workflow. Instead, there's a number of workflows. Every single project that's undertaken has its own workflow. It's hard enough to support the business as IT, but if you don't know what the business actually do, then you can't possibly effectively support them. Core to that support is an understanding of this thing, the workflow. I've witnessed many attempts by IT to try to capture the workflow. So we've had enterprise architects and solution architects chasing Zachman and TOGAF, business process modelers, even people trying to go down to the level of UML and map out exactly what it is that people are doing. And they've all failed. They've all ended up disappointed. They do well with the rest of the business, but then they hit exploration and suddenly it's very, very complex and it all goes wrong. Why is that? Well, exploration is all about uncertainty and risk. There is actually no fixed product at the end of it. The product is just trying to get to a point where somebody is comfortable enough to make a decision and invest some money. Way back in time, at the beginnings of the oil industry, that confidence was just putting a pin in the map somewhere, drilling a hole near where somebody else drilled and found something. And that was good enough. But as our understanding has increased, as the tools that we have available to us have increased as well, we do a lot more activities to try to get comfortable with those decisions, but it's still just reaching a point where someone's comfortable enough with the information that they have available to make a decision and invest some money and actually do something. So there is no fixed endpoint. If you look at other parts of IT within a business, look something like this. It's very linear. It's possible to map it out. It's repetitive. So if you look at the accounts department, if you look at human resources, they don't reinvent what they do every single month. They're not trying to approach every single project in a different way. You don't approach accounts payable in a different way from month to month and have a different product at the end of it. Whereas exploration is about building up a bigger and bigger ball of understanding until at some point somebody is comfortable enough to make an investment decision and reach the next point. So it's not like the rest of the business. If you try to map it out like the rest of the business, you're going to fail. So if you try to map the workflow, it's like taking a map of London, which worked for you perfectly well there, and then flying over to Stavanger and trying to use the same map to navigate your way around the streets. It's not going to work. You're in a different environment, in a different landscape. So does that mean we're completely stumped? Are we completely screwed? There's no possible way to do this? Maybe it's impossible. Nobody can agree on what the workflow is, or what it's for, or what to do with it. But it seems like there is a bit of hope out there. You can identify particular areas of study within geology, geophysics, reservoir engineering that seem to be distinct and repeatable and more understandable. And the activities are based around fixed decision points. So there are some things out there that we can to create that map of a workflow. What we need to do that is an approach that's flexible and component-based. Maybe something like this. Everybody recognize that? How many of you had a set of Lego when you were a small child? Everybody? It was amazing, wasn't it? There was no limit to what you could make with those components, was there? You could create anything in your imagination. So maybe we could use something like this to try to construct our workflows. So let's look at what one of those components might look like. You might try to describe a particular activity. And once you've done that, you could look at the business and you could identify somebody within that business who's an expert at that activity and can talk on behalf of everybody else. Once you've done that, you could work with them to identify the tools that they use that support that activity. And build your understanding of that. If you were to map that out in a slightly more grown-up looking way, you might end up with something like this. So if we take a geophysics task like depth conversion, you might identify a particular individual within the business that can talk to you in depth about depth conversion. You might identify one or more tools that are currently in use, not necessarily the ones that you want to have in use. You can identify what's currently in use there and map that out. You can then classify those by discipline, so geology, geophysics, reservoir engineering, production technology, and then you're starting to get an idea of what's out there. What resolution you do this at? Well, if you ask the business, you're probably going to be waiting for several years before they actually agree on a result. So one way to approach this is to approach the head of geology and say, in 30 components, could you describe what you do? And just see how they got on with that. They have something to work towards, you're more likely to be successful. So we undertook this activity with a mid-size gas producer. We managed to put together something that looked like this. So we mapped out all the activities that we could identify that they conducted.